A recent survey shows that 100% of gamers use some sort of input method in order to translate what they want the game to do into an action that the software can interpret.
That's me using my college degree just to say that everyone who plays video games needs something to control it. Whether that device is a touchscreen, a mouse and keyboard, a controller, or an alternative form of input is up to you. But today, we'll be talking about the good old-fashioned gaming controller.
Particularly, I want to talk about these bad boys back here. The triggers.
I found myself a bit frustrated recently with how modern games use the triggers, and so I've decided to talk about it. Throughout this video, I'll be explaining my personal guidelines as to what kinds of actions should be bound to the triggers, and which ones definitely should not. After I go over that, we'll look at a handful of example games and decide if they pass my test for good trigger mappings.
In case it isn't entirely obvious so far, these rules are just a personal thing for me. So even though I'll be using language like right or wrong or correct and incorrect, nothing in this video should be taken as more than one guy's ramblings.
If your preferred controller bindings is something unholy like jump on a trigger input, and that works for you, then go for it. You psycho.
The first thing I'd like to get out of the way is the idea that there are objectively better choices in mappings for some inputs.
Using the example I just said, it's definitely possible to bind jump to a trigger, but that's a bit unorthodox.
I think a controller, and subsequently its input bindings, work best when everything flows together naturally.
In the most intense moments of your game, whether they be action-oriented, an emotional moment in the story, or something else, you don't want to pull yourself out of the game and back to reality to figure out how to get your character to walk forward.
Over time, I think some inputs have become more and more standardized across the medium.
There's no reason that circle, B, or the escape key on a keyboard couldn't be a method of confirming a text box. But over decades of repetition, that action has pretty much permanently become the job of the X button on PlayStation, the A button on Xbox, and the spacebar or a mouse click on a computer. With this in mind, it's clear that there are industry standards for some inputs.
I guess the triggers aren't really one of those inputs. That, or there's been a shift in the gaming world that I haven't been aware of until now.
Either way, I'm not entirely pleased with how some more recent games I've been playing have handled binding inputs to the triggers. As such, I'll introduce you to my 3.5 uses to best applying a controller's triggers.
My first use for a controller's triggers are for analog inputs.
Most controllers have digital buttons, meaning they register either as on or off. In other words, that means there aren't any shades of gray in your input.
There are many applications where analog inputs aren't necessary, despite what the PS2 thinks, but there are some inputs that are better when made analog.
I think the clearest example of this is for games that allow you to drive vehicles. Having the gas pedal be an analog input allows you to differ how fast you accelerate for different scenarios. If you're on a straightaway, you'll want to put the pedal to the metal, which is accomplished by holding your trigger all the way in. If you're approaching a corner or doing GTRP or something else that requires you to obey a speed limit, you'll want some acceleration, but not the maximum possible.
An analog input allows you to meter this.
The PlayStation 5's included launch title, Astro's Playroom, shows some other applications of this combined with the DualSense's adaptive triggers. In this climbing stage, there are some handholds that are fragile, so you need to press your trigger lightly, as grabbing too hard will dislodge the rock from the wall.
This mechanic was a neat tech demo feature, but I don't see it catching on for most mainstream games.
Still, it's another application of an analog input being needed to achieve the game's goal.
Another important use for the triggers are for inputs that need to be held down.
Racing games and the gas pedal are another instance of this, as you'll want to be accelerating for most of the race, and it's far more comfortable to bend your pointer finger at the knuckle than it is to apply downward pressure with your thumb for extended periods of time. Shooter games fall under this umbrella as well, although they also check the box for another trigger application that I'll cover next. When in a gunfight, you may want to unload a large quantity of ammo without needing to repeatedly tap an input. Call of Duty Zombies is a great example of this. Training an entire round's worth of zombies results in a large horde of the undead that need to be disposed of before they make a meal out of your flesh. The solution? Grab your favorite pack-a-punch LMG and go to town. Could you imagine having to press down a flat button during this entire activity?
Keeping FPS games in mind, the triggers on a controller are also put to great use when their action mirrors the action you're doing in-game. This is my third use for the triggers.
Essentially, trigger-like actions in-game should be achieved through pulling a trigger. The trigger on your controller has a similar physical action to that of one on a gun, so it makes sense for that action to be bound to the trigger.
Other weaponry works well on the triggers too, especially when combined with the DualSense's adaptive triggers, which I'm sure will make it to other consoles as soon as Sony's patent is up.
While I've never shot a bow and arrow in real life, I've seen videos of it, and talking about it would really help me illustrate my point, so I'm just gonna do it, and if you have done archery, please pretend what I'm saying makes sense, even if it doesn't. The tension required to pull back a bowstring and the potential energy being snap-released when you go to fire the arrow just cannot be emulated by holding down and letting go of a button. Both from a narrative and gameplay standpoint, it's a much more satisfying experience to make use of a trigger for this application.
This last point is a little iffy and up for personal interpretation, but I want to put it out there anyway because I feel like it's one of the longest standing uses for the trigger, and I want to rationalize why I think some older games still use the triggers well, even if their use doesn't fit into the previously defined 3 categories.
I'll dub this category quick actions, but it's still a fairly abstract concept.
Feel free to disregard this one if you think it makes my thought process weaker.
Basically, there are just some actions that need to be ready at a moment's notice. Think of a dodge, block, healing item, or other things in that realm.
I think there are better inputs for these actions, but historically, they've had their home on the triggers.
The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time places the ever-important targeting action and the shield on the triggers, so at a moment's notice in combat, you can lock onto your enemy and block its attacks before you take any damage. Most players will rest their pointer fingers on the triggers, so even if your thumbs are bouncing from button to button, your pointers will always be ready to perform these actions.
To summarize, a controller's trigger inputs are best used, in my opinion, when they're used for analog inputs, bound to an action that must be held for long periods of time, mirror the action your character is doing in-game, or if they're reserved for quick actions that you'll need during the heat of gameplay. Now that everything's been laid out, let's do a quick lightning round where we look at some games and see if their use of the triggers matches up with my personal checklist.
Grand Theft Auto 5 has the player using the triggers for all sorts of things, as there's a lot of different control schemes. Driving controls, on-foot controls, flying controls, and shooting controls are all included in GTA 5.
Unsurprisingly, the second best-selling game of all time has controls that get it right.
No matter what activity you're doing, your triggers will always be put to their best use.
Next, we'll look at something completely different. Mario Tennis Aces for the Nintendo Switch.
In this game, your ZL and ZR triggers are used for a trick shot and a zone shot, a mode that slows down time so you can aim your ball with more advanced accuracy. Do these inputs match up with my personal rules? Yes, they do. Having a special ability and a more accurate shot are definitely actions you'll want to activate quickly in a game as intense as Mario Tennis. While they aren't inputs you need super often, you'll want them ready as soon as you do need them. Minecraft was originally created with the mouse and keyboard input method in mind, but in its takeover of the gaming sphere, it found itself ported to most consoles made after 2012. In Minecraft, you do a lot of things, and because of this, a lot of things are bound to the triggers. Mining, punching, fishing, shooting a ranged weapon, placing blocks, and a bunch of other actions are all performed by the L2 and R2 triggers.
The thing with Minecraft is that though most of the game's actions don't mesh with my personal checklist, I still think the game's controls work.
By having such a large variety of actions all bound to the same basic trigger pull, the developers make a mental connection that you can do anything with the triggers. When you discover a new block or a new item, your first instinct is to use your triggers to see exactly how you can interact with it.
There's no fumbling through all your buttons to figure out how to make the new object work. It's all the same input.
How about we look at an older game now? The original Star Fox on SNES uses the controller's two digital triggers for banking left and right with the R-Wing, and double tapping allows the user to
do a barrel roll.
Considering all the buttons available on the controller and all the actions that need bindings, Star Fox gets a pass from me. I'd classify the banking/barrel roll action being bound to the trigger both as a quick input and as an input that mirrors the action, as I imagine pressing a trigger is synonymous with moving an aileron on an aircraft.
In case you didn't know, that's how real airplanes turn. I think?
Lastly, we'll look at a game that's fairly new. New World Eternum by Amazon Games is a hybrid between an MMORPG and an action RPG, apparently, that launched just a few months ago. I pre-ordered this game a few days before launch and brought my PlayStation Portal to work the day it released so I could play it during my lunch break. After making my character and getting through the opening story cutscenes, I was horrified to discover my least favorite thing in all of video game history: melee attacks bound to the triggers.
Spoiler alert, but New World was one of the major reasons why I wanted to make this video.
I seriously don't understand why so many games use the triggers for melee combat. It's incredibly awkward to me.
Just to name a few off the top of my head:
Assassin's Creed, Bloodborne, Skyrim.
Basically anything not from Nintendo at this point.
I'm fully willing to admit that this is entirely my problem.
I'm one of billions of gamers in the world, and the vast majority of people can play something like Elden Ring with no problems. I bet I could play Elden Ring without problems, but there's such a barrier of entry to me.
Could you imagine playing Spider-Man, but your attacks were done by trigger inputs? Is that any different than what we see in the games you just mentioned? It just feels so weird to me.
That's the last I'll say on the matter, I guess. It's weird to me. That's what this whole thing boils down to. I tried to play some games on the PS Plus service, I found the controls weird, and I wanted to talk about it.
I'm thankful many games these days have remappable controls, because there are some great gaming experiences out there that I would otherwise not approach if I weren't able to make things work for me. A massive thank you to all the devs out there who allow controls to be altered to fit the player's wants, even if it's as weird as mapping jump to a trigger or attack to a face button.
At the end of the day, video games are meant to be played.
Whether that requires including a difficulty tailored to just experiencing the story, puzzle skips, or rebindable controls, I think developers are just happy that players are able to experience and enjoy the fruits of their labor. While I may find a lot of modern games to have odd default controls, I too am happy to experience the game. I just might have to do it through someone's Let's Play series.
Time for me to head out now though. I just got a new car and I'm still learning how to drive it. It uses this puzzle cube thingy to change gears, and that's been kind of hard to get used to. I'm putting the time in though and getting my practice in. It was either learn how to use this or get used to swinging my sword with R2 and Sekiro. This seemed easier.